For a few brief years, it looked like men's tennis was about to hand its future over to an entirely new generation. Players born in the mid to late 1990s, Zverev, Tsitsipas, Medvedev, Thiem, Shapovalov, Rublev, arrived together, almost in a wave, each one carrying the kind of talent that made analysts confidently predict the sport's next era had already found its stars. And then it simply didn't happen, not the way anyone expected. Instead of a clean changeover of power, this generation ran headfirst into something almost nobody saw coming, a big three that refused to leave, and then, just as that era finally started fading, a completely different generation, born years later, that leapfrogged them entirely. Sinner and Alcaraz, both born in the 2000s, arrived seemingly out of nowhere and became the faces of men's tennis before most of the 90s generation had ever lifted the trophy their talent seemed to promise. So what actually happened to this group? Was it simply bad timing, a talented generation caught between two immovable eras? Or was there something deeper, something about this specific group of players that kept them from ever fully closing the gap? To really understand this generation's story, you have to look at the sheer weight of who they were up against. Alexander Zverev, Dominic Thiem, Stefanos Tsitsipas, Daniil Medvedev, Denis Shapovalov, Andrei Rublev, nearly all born within a few years of each other, all rising through the junior and early professional ranks at roughly the same time, all carrying the label that tennis loves to hand out prematurely, the next generation. By the late 2010s, that label looked earned. Zverev was winning ATP Finals titles and cracking the top three in the world. Thiem reached multiple French Open finals and eventually broke through for a US Open title in 2020. Tsitsipas reached a French Open final of his own and climbed as high as world number 3. Medvedev pushed all the way to world number 1 and won a US Open in dramatic fashion. On paper, this wasn't a generation that failed to show up. It was a generation that consistently reached the biggest stages tennis has to offer. But reaching those stages and actually claiming them turned out to be two very different things. Because standing directly in their way, for almost the entirety of their primes, were Novak Djokovic, Rafael Nadal, and Roger Federer, three of the greatest players the sport has ever produced, all still competing at an elite level, well into the years when this new generation should have been taking over. Federer eventually faded from major contention, but Djokovic and Nadal didn't just linger, they kept winning. Djokovic in particular seemed to get better with age, methodically dismantling nearly every 90s generation player who dared to challenge him in a Grand Slam final. Thiem lost to Djokovic in the 2020 Australian Open final, before finally breaking through at the US Open later that year. Tsitsipas lost a heartbreaking 5-set French Open final to Djokovic in 2021, after leading 2-0. Medvedev, arguably the group's most successful member against the Big Three, still finished on the losing end of that same Djokovic buzzsaw in multiple major finals, including a crushing straight-sets defeat in the 2023 Australian Open final. And then, just as Djokovic and Nadal finally began slowing down in the mid-2020s, the door that should have swung open for this generation instead opened for someone else entirely. Carlos Alcaraz, born in 2003, and Jannik Sinner, born in 2001, both younger, both arriving with fresher legs and fewer scars from years of losing to the Big Three, stepped through first. By the time the throne was genuinely available, the 90s generation found themselves competing not against fading legends anymore, but against a new, even hungrier wave that had skipped the hardest part of the gauntlet entirely. There's a specific term sports analysts use for a generation caught in exactly this kind of bind, a sandwich generation, talented enough to consistently reach the biggest stages, but boxed in on both sides. First by legends who refused to decline on schedule, then by a younger wave that arrived before the door ever fully opened. But timing alone doesn't fully explain what happened here. Look closer at the head-to-head results, and a pattern emerges that goes beyond simple bad luck. Against Djokovic specifically, in Grand Slam finals, this generation's record is almost uniformly one-sided. Thiem needed a 5th-set tiebreak just to finally get past him in a major final. Tsitsipas, up 2-0 in Paris, still found a way to lose in 5. Medvedev, for all his tactical brilliance, was completely dismantled in that 2023 Australian Open final, unable to find any answer at all. These weren't close calls that could have gone either way. In several of the biggest moments, this generation didn't just lose. They visibly cracked once real pressure arrived. Some analysts point to a psychological gap as the real difference maker, more than any technical shortfall. Djokovic, Nadal, and Federer didn't just have better tennis in these matches. They had a level of composure under maximum pressure that this generation, for whatever reason, struggled to consistently match. Whether that came down to experience, mentality, or simply facing opponents whose big match instincts had been sharpened over a decade of similar situations, the result was the same. Talented players who could get to the mountaintop, but rarely find a way to actually stand on it. There's also a structural factor worth considering. This generation spent their absolute physical primes, the years typically considered an athlete's best window for peak performance, going head-to-head with three of the most mentally fortified competitors the sport has ever produced. By the time Djokovic and Nadal finally began slowing down, several of these players were already past their own athletic peak, carrying the accumulated toll of years spent losing tight, physically brutal matches against opponents who simply wouldn't break. And then, cruelly, just as that toll started catching up with them, Sinner and Alcaraz arrived. Younger, fresher, and crucially, having skipped the hardest years of facing the big three at their absolute best. The 90s generation had to fight through the toughest gauntlet in tennis history to even get a chance at the top. The generation right behind them largely didn't have to. The consequences of this bind extend well beyond one generation's disappointing trophy count. Look at where these players ended up, career-wise, and a clear pattern emerges. Zverev, still active and genuinely excellent, has finally captured his first major title. But it took until his late 20s, and it came in a season where both Sinner and Alcaraz were compromised by injury, not at full strength. Thiem retired in 2024, his body worn down, having captured exactly one Grand Slam in a career that once looked destined for several. Tsitsipas and Rublev, both still competing, have watched younger players consistently leapfrog them in rankings and relevance, their own windows for sustained dominance seemingly having closed without ever fully opening. This raises a genuinely uncomfortable question for how tennis history will remember this group. Individually, several of these players have had outstanding careers by almost any normal measure: multiple Grand Slam finals, extended stays inside the top 5, career earnings and trophy counts that most players would consider enormously successful. But collectively, as a generation that was supposed to define an era of men's tennis, they'll likely be remembered instead as a cautionary tale, proof of just how brutal the sport's timing can be, regardless of talent. There's also a broader lesson here about how tennis eras actually work, one that complicates the simple, clean narrative fans often want. We tend to think of the sport in terms of clear generational handoffs, one era ending, a new one beginning, like a torch being passed cleanly from one group to the next. But the 90s generation story shows how messy that process can actually get. Sometimes a genuinely talented generation gets squeezed from both directions at once, caught between legends who refuse to decline and an even younger wave arriving faster than anyone predicted, with no clean opening ever really appearing for the players caught in between. Zverev's French Open breakthrough this year offers a small, complicated coda to this story. It proves the talent was always real, that given the right circumstances, an injured Alcaraz, a depleted field, this generation could still find a way to claim what once seemed permanently out of reach. But it also underscores exactly how much had to go wrong for someone else before that door finally opened, decades into careers that should have delivered far more, far sooner. So how should tennis history actually remember this generation? Zverev, Thiem, Tsitsipas, Medvedev, Shapovalov, Rublev, a group of players who arrived together, chased greatness together, and, for the most part, watched it slip through their fingers together. Calling them a failure would be unfair and inaccurate. These were players who reached the very top of the sport's biggest stages, who competed in Grand Slam finals against three of the greatest champions tennis has ever produced, and who, in Thiem's case and now finally Zverev's, did manage to break through and claim major titles despite everything working against them. That's not nothing. For most players in tennis history, even one Grand Slam final represents the achievement of a lifetime. But there's still something undeniably bittersweet about this generation's place in the sport's story. They were talented enough to be the era, They simply weren't fortunate enough in timing to actually get to own it. Trapped between legends who refused to fade on any predictable schedule, and a younger wave that arrived faster and hungrier than anyone anticipated, this group became something tennis rarely produces so clearly: a genuinely gifted generation, defined less by what they won and more by the impossible gauntlet they were asked to run through first. Maybe that's the real lesson buried in this story. Greatness in sport isn't only about talent, it's about talent meeting the right moment. And for the 90s generation of men's tennis, that moment simply never fully arrived. Not because they weren't good enough, but because two of the most demanding competitive windows in the sport's history happened to close in on them from both sides at once, leaving a generation that came agonizingly close to defining an era, remembered instead as the one that got caught in between. Sometimes the difference between a legend and a footnote isn't talent, it's timing. If this gave you a new way of seeing this generation, hit subscribe. We tell the stories other channels skip.